According to the West, this guy is crazy. Since the war in Ukraine began, there has been a campaign to isolate and financially cripple Russia, with sanctions that would make them think twice about waging a war with their geographical neighbor. Sounds good, right? Well, has the West been playing by its own rules, or are they meant for others? Let's see what the Hungarian Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade has to say on the matter.
We have been under constant pressure not to work together with the Russians on nuclear energy, not to buy nuclear fuel from the Russians. I mean, if we don't buy nuclear fuel from the Russians, we have to shut down the nuclear power plants of ours, nuclear power plant, which currently covers 33% of the electricity demand of ours. Okay, stop buying nuclear fuel. Who was the #1 supplier of uranium of the United States last year? Russia. United States spent more than $1 billion on Russian uranium last year. Russia was the #1 uranium supplier of the United States last year, and they are putting pressure on us not to buy fuel from the Russians. Oil.
Huh? Oil? Who said something about oil, bitch? You cooking? Oil.
The Western Europeans are so proud of themselves. We got rid of Russian oil. You Central Europeans, you could not make it. You know, that's how much we are better than you. You know, we got rid of Russian oil. Share of Russian oil to India was below 1% before the war. Now it's very close to 40%. Before the war, Europe was not buying Indian oil. Now Europe is the #1 customer of Indian oil. Indian oil, okay? So, and since we are not buying it, I guess there are others in Europe who are buying it, and those must be those who say that they are not buying oil from Russia. So when it comes to cooperation with Russia, I understand it's very easy to say that, you know, Szijjártó is friend of Lavrov, Orban is meeting with Putin, you know, you Hungarians, you are, you know, traitors, you are the propagandists of Kremlin. Very easy to say. But when you look behind the scenes, you see that those who are accusing us, they are making much bigger business and much bigger deals with the Russians than we do. So, I mean, you have to look at facts. I understand politics is, you know, on many occasions about perceptions, ideologies, whatever. But if you look at the facts, then you find some surprises. But, you know, not everybody is, you know, ready enough, you know, to look after these facts.